Dead America, the Second Month, Seattle Rebuild, Part 2. Written by Derek Slayton. Narrated by Aaron Smith. Chapter 1. Seattle Rebuild, Day 3. Skylar gripped her seatbelt tight as the plane bounced through turbulence. High above the clouds, sunlight bathed the ancient plane's interior. Several of the soldiers napped, as well as the other 3 oil rig workers next to her, but she couldn't sleep. And it wasn't just the turbulence. She sighed and stared out the window, the clouds clearing just enough to see the vast stretches of Canadian wilderness. "Why in the world would you volunteer for this, you dumbass?" she thought bitterly, brushing her shoulder-length black hair over her shoulder. "You had it set in Seattle. Safety, warmth, other people." She smirked to herself. There it is, other people. As much as this one-way trip was going to suck, at least I won't have to deal with other people. She glanced over at one of the awake soldiers, and as if he had heard her thoughts, he shot her a smile and a wink. She ignored the short private's feeble attempt at flirting, and turned back to the window. Well, too many people at any rate, she thought. A large sergeant made his way through the narrow aisle, working his way to the front. Skylar moved her arm out of the way so he could get through. "Sorry, ma'am," he said gruffly, tipping his head to her. The gentlemanly gesture looked almost comical on his over 6-foot-tall, completely stacked frame. His neck was the diameter of her waist. "You're fine," she said with a small smile. "I can't sleep on this rust bucket anyway." He took a knee next to her. "I'm Sergeant Caldwell," he said. "Sorry we didn't have the time to get properly introduced before taking off." "Skylar," she replied with a nod, ignoring his apology. "So I'm assuming you're in charge of this little expedition?" Caldwell nodded. "Afraid so, ma'am," he said. "I get that starting the oil up again is important, but is it really wake us up at 2 a.m. important?" Skylar asked, raising an eyebrow. He barked a laugh. "Unfortunately, in this case, I believe it was," he admitted. "There's apparently a storm rolling in a couple of days from now, so they wanted to get us up there with as much time as possible to secure everything." "Still, waking someone up at 2 a.m. should be punishable by public flogging," she retorted. Caldwell smirked. "Well, if any of these boys decides to do that to you while we're up here, you let me know, and I'll make the public flogging happen," he said. "Good to know there's a possibility of some entertainment," she quipped. They shared a small laugh, and then he looked towards the front of the plane at Corporal McFadden, who was waving to him. "If you'll excuse me," Caldwell said, "duty calls." She nodded and turned back towards the window, back to her thoughts. Sergeant Caldwell slipped into the co-pilot's seat. "What do we have, McFadden?" he asked. "Whole lot of headwind, Sarge," the corporal replied. "I'm guessing that's a concern?" Caldwell asked, brow furrowing. McFadden tapped the fuel gauge, which was alarmingly close to E. The sergeant sighed. "That's a yes, then," he said. "What's that mean in real terms?" "It means we're going to be lucky to make the airport," McFadden replied. "That flyby of the town ain't gonna happen." The sergeant sighed, shaking his head. "I'd love to have actual intel on what we're walking into, but it is what it is," he conceded. "Just get us safely to the ground, and we'll worry about the rest later." "Be on the ground in 20, sir," the corporal promised. Caldwell patted McFadden on the shoulder as he stepped into the back of the plane. He smacked the metal wall a couple of times, jarring everyone awake. "All right," he barked. "I know it's early as hell, but you need to wake your asses up now." The sleeping members of the crew struggled to wake up and focus, and the sergeant gave the wall a few more slaps before all eyes were on him and relatively clear. "Everybody with us?" he demanded, and received a chorus of grumbles. "Good. We're 20 minutes out, and we have some things to go over." Everyone perked up at that, readying themselves, including the oil workers. "Our target is Dawson Creek," he began, and then sighed. "Yeah, I know. Keep your Van de Beek jokes to yourself." He waved a hand. It's a town of 13,000 people located in the middle of fucking nowhere in the frigid terrain of northwest Canada. Now what it lacks in location or amenities, it more than makes up for with access to oil fields. Our mission is to secure these fields and get the oil flowing to Seattle again." "Question, Sarge," Private Murray said, raising his hand. "A town of 13,000 sounds pretty damn big for 6 of us to handle." Caldwell cocked a brow. "Was there a question in there somewhere?" he asked. Murray stammered. "Why the hell aren't there more of us?" "Because they don't have the fuel to get more of us here," the sergeant quipped. "But don't worry, Private. The satellite imagery shows a lot of corpses on the main roads in town. With the weather, it's safe to assume that they're frozen stiff." "And if they're not?" Private Rabin piped up. Caldwell grunted. "Then you get to use the skills Uncle Sam spent so much time and money to teach you," he shot back. "Also, you tap into the 1,000 rounds of ammunition you each have. Now, you treat those bullets like they're made of gold, because we have more bullets on this plane than most of the front lines combined. As you all know, this is a one-way trip, at least for several months, so they wanted us to be prepared." "So you're telling me that with all that technology, they couldn't determine if huge masses of flesh-eating corpses have moved recently?" one of the rig workers drawled. The sergeant narrowed his eyes. "Who are you?" he asked. "Name's Kevin," the man pointed at himself. He was easily the oldest of the riggers, and looked like he was in his mid-40s. He also looked like he'd been through the ringer, in more ways than one. "Specialist," he added. "Well, Kevin, this mission came up spur of the moment, so they were only able to do one pass of the target," the sergeant explained. "So we're going on the best intel we have." Another rigger, a mid-30s looking man with a shiny bald head, raised his hand. "So, if you boys are getting 1,000 rounds of ammo, what are we getting?" he asked. "I can only do so much damage with my devastating good looks." There were a few chuckles, but Caldwell held up his hand to get everyone back on track. "We've got a sidearm for each of you and about 100 rounds, he said. "It isn't much, but if things go to plan, none of you will be out of our sight for very long." "What's the objective once we land?" Private Green asked. "The airport is on the eastern side of town," Caldwell replied. "We land, we find transportation, and get to the other side of town. Our first target is an oil company's office. This should not only provide a safe base of operations for us, but should have the oil field information we need. Figure out what rigs are operational, pipeline, stuff like that." The corporal smacked the wall of the cockpit, and Caldwell turned around. "McFadden?" he asked. "We're starting to lose altitude," the corporal called. "You'd better get strapped in, Sarge." The sergeant nodded. "All right, everybody, strap in and hold on to your asses," he bellowed. "This is going to be a bumpy ride." Chapter 2. Everyone in the plane strapped in, holding on for dear life as the engines started to sputter. They were about half a mile short of the airport runway and began to drop fast. There were a couple of frustrated grunts on the plane, as some of them realized they might not make it. "Hold on!" McFadden screamed. The plane descended rapidly as the engines completely shut off. The corporal held a death grip on the controls, muttering every obscenity imaginable under his breath. The ground came up quickly, but the runway was just on the other side of the field. He was hopeful that they could make it. Schuyler looked out the window at the town in the distance. The streets were nearly black with the number of figures in them, but her eyes widened when she realized they were moving. They weren't frozen solid, they were moving. She turned in her seat, waving maniacally at the sergeant. He caught her gaze, and she pointed towards the window, but his brow furrowed in confusion. "Look at the town!" she screamed. The sergeant looked out the window, and Schuyler watched the terror dawn in his eyes when he realized what she had meant. The zombies were still able to move. "One problem at a time," the sergeant barked, and she nodded, clenching her jaw and bracing for impact. McFadden continued to guide the plane, fighting the headwind and other turbulence as he did. The runway started to get closer, only about a quarter mile away, As he focused on getting the plane down safely, he glanced further down the runway towards the hangars. "Fuck my life," the corporal muttered, and froze when he spotted a few dozen figures on the opposite side of the runway by the hangars. They were all moving, slowly, but lumbering all the same. That would have to wait, though, because if he couldn't get the plane on the ground, it didn't matter. Just before the wheels touched down, there was one more violent gust of wind, forcing the plane hard onto the runway. The old aircraft bounced, smacking off of the asphalt and several yards back into the air, sending people flying all over in the cabin. The plane finally stayed down, and McFadden slammed on the brakes. But there were icy patches on the runway, sending the craft skidding sideways. People cried out and grunted as they slammed into each other in the back, with a few minor screams. After a few terrifying seconds, the plane finally came to a stop. Everyone sat in stunned silence for a moment before the corporal unbuckled his safety harness and jumped into the back, barking orders. "Rabin, Murray, weapons hot now," he said. Everyone blinked at him in confusion, including the two privates he'd addressed. "What's going on, Corporal?" Rabin asked. "Zombies on the runway, towards the hangars," McFadden urged. The privates quickly grabbed their weapons as he opened the door and lowered a ladder so they could get down the couple of yards from the door to the ground. When he poked his head out, he could see the number of zombies growing, coming out of a hangar a couple 100 yards away. "Secure the landing zone," the corporal called. "Rest of us are coming." Rabin and Murray climbed down, sweeping the area for immediate threats as Caldwell stuck his head out the door to survey the situation. "Something's going down at that hangar," McFadden said, pointing. "They just keep pouring out." The sergeant clenched his jaw for a moment and then ducked back inside to face the group. "Oil workers, you sit tight," he instructed. "We have to deal with something." "Yo, come on," Kevin protested. "We can help." "I have no doubt that you can," the sergeant argued. "But it's way too early to be risking your lives, especially since you're the only 4 people within 1,000 miles who know how to work those rigs. So sit tight and let us do our jobs." Kevin nodded and sat back as the rest of the soldiers geared up with their assault rifles. They quickly descended the ladder as the 2 privates outside popped off the occasional round. Caldwell was the last one out, stopping before descending the ladder. He shot a pointed look at Skylar. "You shut this door and don't open it until we clear the area," he instructed. "I'll take care of it," she said. One of the other riggers raised his hand. "And if you don't clear the area?" he asked shakily. "Then we're fucked, so quit asking stupid questions and let them get to it," Skylar snapped. Caldwell nodded sharply. "What she said," he added, and then disappeared down the ladder. Skylar closed the door behind him and secured it. The sergeant slid down the ladder, hitting the ground hard. There were dozens of zombies between them and the hangar. He looked past them at a steady stream coming from the building. "Report," he said. "The hangar is pretty big, Sarge," McFadden said. "I think we should assume it's full." The sergeant nodded. "We could clear it, but burn through most of our ammo in the process," he mused. "And we're going to need it." "You saw downtown too?" the corporal asked dryly. "What about downtown?" Haddon called over his shoulder, aiming and firing to take out a close-by zombie. "The zombies we were told were frozen are very much thawed," Caldwell said. The private gritted his teeth. "Shit," he said. "Ideas?" the sergeant asked. "We could plug the hole with bodies," Green piped up. "That's only a temporary fix," Murray said. Green shrugged. "Better than no fix at all," he shot back. "What about one of the fuel trucks over there?" Rabin suggested. "Block the door off." Caldwell looked over at the smaller fuel truck sitting in a line of other vehicles. He knew that it wasn't big enough to get the plane back to Seattle, and it was the biggest vehicle there. "McFadden, Rabin, get it moving," he said, making the snap decision. "Everybody else, start moving forward. Clear them a path and eliminate anything moving that shouldn't be." There was a chorus of, "Yes, sir," as everyone went to do their jobs. McFadden and Rabin headed towards the vehicles, which included a few 4-wheel drive trucks and a fuel truck. As they approached, a handful of zombies emerged from behind them, heading their way. McFadden stopped and slung his rifle over his shoulder, drawing his sidearm and pulling out a knife. "Don't fire unless you have a clear shot," the corporal instructed. "Can't risk hitting the vehicles, unless you want to walk." Rabin shuddered. "I'm already freezing," he quipped. "The less time I have to stay outside, the better." He drew his own weapons, readying himself to strike. They waited for the zombies to get about 10 yards away from the vehicles, giving them the opportunity to flank them a bit and clear the area behind them. McFadden stepped up first towards a trio of zombies packed within a yard of each other. He jammed his blade into the face of the lead one, swinging it to the side and into the one on the left. He let go of the knife, allowing the two to fall to the ground before taking careful aim and firing a near point-blank shot into the other's face. He turned to the living one on the ground and executed it. Rabin faced down with 4 of them, again closely bunched together. He opted to run towards the leader, leaping and delivering a front kick to its chest. The impact sent it back into 2 others, causing them to stumble. Rabin rushed forward to the unaffected one, jamming his blade into the creature's temple before quickly executing the 3 that were struggling to regain their footing. 3 quick shots later, and they were all down. "Clear," Rabin said. The corporal nodded. "Clear," he added. "Let's get to the truck." Rabin approached the vehicle first, doing a quick check underneath to make sure there were no threats. Once confirmed, he opened the door and started working on getting the vehicle started, searching the cab for keys. As he searched, McFadden stood guard, making sure there weren't any others lurking behind the vehicles. "So, how'd they rope you into this suicide mission?" the corporal asked as he kept his head on a swivel. "What do you mean?" Rabin quipped. "They woke me up and told me to get on the plane." McFadden's brow furrowed. "They didn't ask you if you wanted to do this mission?" he asked. "Do they ever?" the private retorted. "They were supposed to," McFadden said, shaking his head. Rabin paused from looking in the glove box, sitting up to glare at his superior. "Are you shitting me?" he demanded. "You mean I could have opted out?" "Yep," the corporal confirmed with a sharp nod. "They were supposed to ask due to the nature of this mission." Rabin opened his mouth, but then closed it again as he thought over how the morning had gone. "Wait a second," he said slowly, and then his eyes darkened as he spoke. "I remember sleeping, and there was a knock at the door. Green opened it and talked to somebody. A few seconds later the light was on and I was being told to pack up, and holy shit, that motherfucker volunteered me!" McFadden couldn't contain his laughter, despite giving it an epic try. There was nothing that could be done about the situation now, and he couldn't hold in his mirth. Rabin stammered, shaking his head like a bobblehead. "Are you laughing?" "Sorry," the corporal gasped, finally clamping his mouth shut and schooling his expression. "It's not funny." "No, it really isn't," Rabin snapped. "I'm gonna whoop his ass." McFadden shook his head. "That's too easy," he said. "We're going to be here for months. Plan your revenge accordingly. I'll back your play." The private pointed at him before leaning back to dig in the glove box. "And that's what good commanding officers do," he said, and then finally found a keyring. "Got him!" He jingled the keys and sat up, starting the truck. It took a few tries since it had been sitting for at least a month in cold temperatures. "Try not to run him over," the corporal said, pressing his lips together hard to keep from smiling. "No promises," Rabin muttered. He revved the engine a bit to make sure it was okay and would keep running, and when he was finally convinced, he shut the door. "You take care of the hangar," McFadden instructed. "I'll make sure our oil field people are secure." Rabin gave the corporal a thumbs up and then popped the truck into gear, taking off. Meanwhile, Caldwell led the other 3 soldiers towards the hangar, picking off zombie after zombie with extreme precision. When they were within 20 yards of it, they could see the problem. The hangar door had slid open a couple of yards and zombies poured out, and with each one that pushed through, the door moved ever so slightly more open. "Shit, that truck isn't going to do the trick," the sergeant muttered. "What are we doing, Sarge?" Murray asked. "Murray, you're with me," Caldwell replied. "Green, Haddon, keep picking them off and keep the attention on you. Focus on the ones right by the door and send them back inside." He and Murray ran around the zombies, full speed towards the other side of the hangar, where the sliding door slowly opened further and further. It was a rolling door that had been installed on its side, curling up into a round container attached to the wall. They reached it as the other two continued to fire, keeping the attention on them. Caldwell reached the end of the wall, seeing the situation. He pressed his palms against the metal door as hard as he could, motioning for the private to do the same. "Start pushing!" he bellowed. The two men struggled to gain traction, as the zombies on the other end had more leverage, forcefully moving out. The only thing allowing them to inch it in that direction was the simple fact that the zombies weren't actively pushing back. Their hands continually slipped, causing pain on their part as the top layer of skin pulled away. Both men screamed as the combination of that and the extreme cold of the metal door made for a very uncomfortable experience. Slowly but surely, the door continued to close, but they caught, abruptly stopping. "What the hell?" Murray cried. Caldwell looked up towards the door, seeing several pairs of legs sticking out from the building and blocking their way. "We're never going to get this thing closed," he muttered. A roar of an engine caught his attention, and he looked up at an approaching truck. Rabin behind the wheel and driving fast towards them. A plan took form quickly in his mind. "Push the other way!" he yelled. "What?" Murray exclaimed. "Trust me, now push!" Caldwell barked. Murray complied and the two of them started pushing, opening the door further. The sergeant grabbed the communicator on his head, clicking it on. "Rabin, push them back in," he instructed. The private didn't respond, but the truck sped up, and the soldiers leapt out of the way so he could line himself up perfectly. Rabin floored it as he got closer to the door, and zombies began to bounce off of the front end of the vehicle as he rammed his way inside. The truck came to a quick stop and sat there. Caldwell watched Rabin freeze, staring at the sheer amount of zombies in the hangar, mesmerized. He slapped his communicator. "Get the fuck out of there, man!" he barked. Rabin snapped out of it and popped the truck in reverse, speeding out. As soon as he was clear, Green and Haddon stepped forward, unloading an entire magazine each into the crowd coming their way, the latter managing to pull a corpse out of the way of the door. Caldwell and Murray yelled as they slammed the door shut, and Green quickly latched it, finally ending the threat. Rabin turned off the truck and hopped out as the soldiers converged in front of the door. "Everybody okay?" he asked, and there were head nods all around, along with a chorus in the affirmative. "Damn fine driving, Rabin," he clapped the private on the shoulder, wincing at the rawness in his palm from the door. "Thanks, Sarge," Rabin replied, still pale. "How'd it look in there?" Murray asked carefully. The private shuddered. "Like hell's waiting room," he replied, shaking his head. "There had to have been a couple thousand of those things in there." "Where the hell did they all come from?" Green asked. "I thought this town isn't that big even during peak season, let alone dead of winter." Caldwell shook his head with a scoff under his breath. "Shit," he said. "It's the Alaska Highway." "The what?" Green asked. "Alaska Highway," the sergeant repeated, looking around his men. "Overland trucking route from Edmonton to Anchorage. This is one of the only big towns between the two locations, so if people were trying to escape Edmonton, they might have only been able to make it this far before running out of fuel," Haddon finished, scrubbing a hand down his face. Rabin shook his head. "If that's the case, then where the hell are all the cars?" he asked. "More importantly, is why were all those people locked away like that?" Green cut in. The sergeant wrinkled his nose. "Maybe the locals knew about the virus and how it impacted A-type blood," he suggested. "This is a remote location, so it's likely that they had a bit of time before things got too serious." "If that's the case, then everybody in town must have been infected, because that was a shitload of corpses in there, and that's just one hangar," Rabin pointed out. "They panicked," Murray murmured. Rabin cocked a brow, turning to him. "What?" he asked. "The town panicked," Murray replied. "There can't be that many blood-testing kits in a town this size, so when outsiders came in, they rounded them up to protect themselves." The insinuation hung in the air for a moment, sinking in for all of them. "Doesn't look like it did them much good, though," Caldwell finally said with a sigh. "If it did, then downtown wouldn't look like an undead block party." He shook his head. "One problem at a time, though. Rabin, Murray, get us a couple of working vehicles. We'll get the VIPs and meet you over there. Our mission priorities just expanded." Chapter 3. There were 2 vehicles up and running, a pickup truck and a giant SUV that looked like it could fit a small football team. They warmed up as everybody stood around, waiting as the sergeant looked at a satellite image. A couple of main things were circled and outlined, including the downtown area, which was the main objective, and a road around the exterior of town marked Dangerous Goods Road. "Okay, everybody, listen up," Caldwell said loudly. "This mission has changed. Our priority is to still secure the oil facility and figure out our next move from there. But on the flight in, we observed a potential threat coming from downtown. The zombies we were assured were frozen are in fact moving and very much a threat. We need to assess just how big of a threat it is." "Lay it out for us, Sarge," Murray said as he rubbed his palms together. Caldwell nodded, motioning as he spoke. "McFadden, Green, and Murray, you 3 are on recon," he began. "I want you to get as close to downtown as you can, preferably without being spotted. See if you can figure out the level of threat, and any potential solutions to it. Everybody else is on me. We are going to be taking the Dangerous Goods Road around the downtown area. It leads straight to the oil company building. With any luck, the road will be clear and we can get there without incident." The corporal raised a hand. "Once we complete the recon, where do you want us?" he asked. Caldwell studied his map, looking at the key for a few color splotches on it. He honed in on a blue dot to the north of the city, a few miles to the east of the oil building. "Here," he said, tapping on the page. "It's marked on here as a greenhouse. If we're going to survive long term, we're going to need to get some things growing. Secure it and await further instructions." McFadden nodded thoughtfully. "Not to mention, if there are going to be survivors anywhere," he said slowly, "that's probably going to be a good place to check." "If there are survivors, do your best to make nice with them," the sergeant said. "We already have enough to deal with." "Yes, sir," McFadden replied. Caldwell looked around and then waved a hand around his head. "All right, let's load up," he said. Rabin got behind the wheel of the giant SUV and the sergeant took shotgun, settling it beside him. Haddon and the oil workers piled into the back seats, and the other 3 took the extended cab pickup truck. They gave their final waves before taking off in different directions. Rabin turned right onto the Dangerous Goods Road, and Haddon leaned forward curiously. "What the hell is a dangerous goods road, anyway?" he asked. "If you have trucks loaded with oil, or any manner of dangerous chemicals used in the extraction of oil, the last thing you'd want is for there to be an accident near civilians," Schuyler explained, "especially given how remote of a location they're in." "Yep," Eugene added. "That's how you make the evening news back in civilization." Kevin cocked a brow. "Do I detect a hint of been there, done that?" he prompted. Eugene sighed deeply. "To be clear, I wasn't the one driving," he said firmly, and light laughter rippled through the vehicle. "Pretty sure the only reason it wasn't a higher story is because the football playoffs were going on. Coverage of a big sporting event makes for more eyes on the screen than some dumbass truck driver poisoning a small town's water supply." "Well, at least you didn't start a fire at a facility," Gerald piped up. Haddon shook his head rapidly. "I'm starting to get concerned with the level of talent we have for this mission," he said dryly. "I can assure you that we are some of the most qualified people in the world," Kevin declared proudly. Haddon cocked a brow. "Before the apocalypse or now?" he asked. Kevin shrugged sheepishly. "Now," he said. There was some horror laughs from the soldiers in the vehicle as the private shook his head. Kevin wasn't wrong, though. They were, most likely, some of the most knowledgeable people in the world on oil, even though they were probably years away from being qualified to be middle management within a firm. Before Haddon could comment any further, Rabin slammed on the brakes, lurching everyone forward. The private instinctively gripped his rifle tightly. "What the hell?" he snapped. "Shut up and look," Rabin replied. pointing out the front window. Everybody looked forward, and the entire cab went silent. The only sound was the rumble of the engine and the heater blowing warm air onto their shocked faces. On either side of the road was a never-ending stream of vehicles. Cars, trucks, campers, everything. All off of the road, parked, stretching as far as the eye could see. "Well, we found the cars they got here in," Haddon breathed. Skylar took a deep breath. "And we found them," she said. "Look in the grass." The fields to either side of the stationary convoys were corpses, just a complete carpet of bodies. Caldwell opened his door, grabbing his assault rifle. "Sarge?" Raven asked, voice strained with surprise. "Stay here, keep the engine running," the sergeant said, and got out of the vehicle. Skylar stepped out of the back seat and moved up behind him, and he turned, brow furrowing as he began to protest. Her glare at him was no nonsense, and he didn't want to waste time arguing, so he rolled his eyes and motioned for her to follow closely. The two of them walked towards a camper with a few corpses huddled together out the back of it, about 10 yards away. There were 4 people, all curled up under a blanket, in front of what looked like a fire pit. The bodies were frozen solid. Caldwell gave one of them a little nudge with his rifle, and they barely moved. He gave it a little more force, but still nothing. Skylar walked past the pit, standing over the field where the grass reached her knee. "Caldwell?" she whispered. "You gotta see this." He joined her, and they stared down at 6 people laying face down in the ground. Each had a bullet wound in the back of their head, and he knelt down to inspect the bullet casings littering the ground. "It's like they were executed," Skylar breathed, voice thick. "Probably refused to go to the hangar," Caldwell mused. "My guess is some of the townsfolk didn't take too kindly to that. Made an example of these people." She shuddered. "And the frozen people?" she asked. He shrugged. "Ran out of fuel, desperate to stay warm, so they set a fire," he suggested. "Even with that little bit of heat, they weren't able to stave off the weather. I can't imagine how cold it gets up here, especially at night. But since the high today feels like freezing, it can't be good." Skylar swallowed hard. "So much cruelty," she whispered. "Just fear and confusion," the sergeant said with a sigh. "Our government's response was to cover it up and run away from the fight. Not sure Canada's was much better. At least in America everybody had a gun they could defend themselves with. Imagine being up here, no help from the government, the world gone mad, and all you have is a baseball bat." "Well, somebody had a gun, or else these men wouldn't have a bullet in the backs of their heads," Skylar said dryly, motioning to the corpses. The sergeant nodded as he stood up. "Private security, maybe?" he asked. "I'm sure some oil exec had to make his way out here from time to time." The two of them walked a little further down the line, seeing more bodies strewn about, all of them with bullets in their backs and a handful of people just frozen. They cut back to the road, peeking in vehicles and seeing more of the same, frozen corpses with the occasional bullet through the window. "Like shooting fish in a barrel," Caldwell said, shaking his head. Skylar clenched her fists. "These poor people never had a chance," she said. "Come on, we need to keep moving," the sergeant said, and waved for Raven to come pick them up. He drove up and the duo got back inside. The private drove slowly through the slaughtering fields, looking out at the poor souls who had died what had likely been a quick but frightening death. Chapter 4. McFadden, Green, and Murray parked their truck a few blocks from the main road, stashing it in a business parking lot. The 3 of them got out, looking around and seeing a handful of creatures moving towards them. "Take those bastards out quietly," McFadden said. "Don't need to be causing a scene just yet." The 2 men did as instructed, casually walking up to the lumbering corpses and driving their knives into the creatures' heads. Once they were eliminated, they came back to the corporal, who held up a satellite image of the area. He pointed to where they were on the southeast side of town right at the edge. "Okay, we're just about as far outside of town as we can get," he said. "The main road through town is 3 blocks north of here. We move quick, get an idea of what we're dealing with, then we haul ass back to the truck." Green raised his hand. "Remind me again why we aren't driving, Corporal?" he asked. "Great idea," Murray drawled, rolling his eyes. "Let's make a bunch of noise by an army of ghouls." "That's what the truck is for," Green argued. "So we can get the fuck out of here. Who cares if they notice us?" "I care," McFadden cut in. "Because until we know what we're dealing with, and where we're lying low, I don't want to run the risk of pulling an undead army in that direction. Now, move quick, move silent, and nobody fires a shot unless I do. That clear?" Both soldiers murmured a quick, "Yes, sir," and the corporal nodded. "Move out," he said. He led the trio up towards the building, looking down the side street leading north towards the main road. There were a handful of creatures, nothing too major, spread out fairly well. Only about a dozen or so were within view over the next block. McFadden moved swiftly, the others keeping pace behind him, the trio hugging the wall for cover until they made it to the next block. He looked both ways down the side streets, seeing a few dozen in each direction. There were businesses on both sides with broken-out display windows and a handful of zombies coming out, attracted by the noise. "We're starting to attract a crowd here," Green murmured. "It's manageable. Just keep moving," the corporal instructed. The trio moved across the street, the two privates stepping up to take out a couple of ghouls with their blades. As they hit the ground, more groans grew behind them, as zombies pressed against the glass of a large department store window. There were dozens of them, pushing hard, and soon the telltale sounds of glass cracking rose above the moans. "We need to turn back," Murray hissed. The corporal engaged with two zombies, slicing and dicing them up. As he dropped them, he turned to take stock of the situation. His face fell as the glass gave way, and ghouls poured out onto the street behind them. The trio paused for a brief moment, staring at the narrow pathway along the sidewalk back towards the vehicle. "What are we doing?" Green urged. "We gotta move now," Murray hissed, and broke from the duo, sprinting hard along the sidewalk. He sidestepped around zombies as they reached for him. The ghouls from the department store focused on him, making a beeline for the fresh meat, closing the open space on the road. Murray ran at maximum speed, racing past the ghouls and trying to get on the other side of them. He still had about 20 yards to go for freedom, but the zombies coming from the department store had nearly blocked him in. A second later, a couple of shots rang out, hitting the ghouls close to him. McFadden aimed his rifle carefully again, pulling the trigger and taking out a few creatures that had a shot at getting him. The corporal and Green watched as Murray vanished on the other side of the mob, with some of the creatures lumbering after the speedster, and the rest coming towards them. "We gotta move, Corporal," Green urged. McFadden smacked his communicator. "Murray, do you copy?" he asked. "I'm here," the private came back. "You good?" the corporal asked. "Yes, sir," Murray replied immediately. McFadden let out a short sigh of relief. "Good," he said. "Get back to the truck. Get it out of town and await my call. Keys are in the ignition." "Yes, sir," Murray replied firmly. McFadden cut the communicator and turned to his partner. "Come on, Green. Let's do what we came here to do." The zombies on the road had gotten close, forcing the duo to fight them off by pushing them back onto one another. They got back to stabbing, knowing they'd already caused enough of a headache with all the shooting. They ran the next 2 blocks, putting some distance between them and the horde. As they approached, zombies stumbled between several vehicles. When they reached the main road, they looked back towards town, and it was a horrific sight. Vehicles were bumper to bumper on the main road with a roadblock just before the downtown area. Every empty space between the cars were filled with corpses, all of whom shambled towards them hungrily. "Jesus Christ, there are thousands of those things," Green breathed. The corporal quickly pulled out his map, looking it over. There was a residential area about 6 blocks to the north, with some vacant-looking plots of land 3 blocks up. Dirt with specks of stuff in the corner. He turned around as the mob of zombies behind him continued to grow. "Come on, I got a hunch," he said as he stuffed the map back in his pocket. "Oh, good. A hunch," Green quipped. "For a moment there, I thought you were contemplating having an actual plan." McFadden shot him a glare to quiet him down. "Just come on," he urged. The duo ran across the main road, zombies emerging quickly from the traffic jam. The corporal drew his handgun and opened fire, prompting his companion to do the same. They fired as they ran, hitting a couple of ghouls in the head before reaching the cars. They leapt up onto the hoods and paused, looking down the main stretch and seeing thousands of ghouls coming from downtown towards them. "Get to the other side!" McFadden barked. They jumped from car to car, narrowly avoiding the outstretched hands of the ghouls trapped between the vehicles. A hand clipped Green's boot as he leapt, throwing off his balance. He landed awkwardly on the next roof and was unable to stop, forcing him to jump again and land on his belly on the next car. Hands immediately clawed at him, pulling him towards the edge of the roof, towards the waiting mouths of the undead. He screamed, frantically flailing and trying to get up. Just before a zombie could put teeth to flesh, McFadden opened fire, hitting a couple of zombies in the head and giving Green the opportunity to pull himself up. He stood in the middle of the roof to catch his breath. The corporal leapt to the car next to him. "You good?" he asked. "Pissed myself a bit," Green admitted with a nod, "but nothing I can't recover from." "Good, keep going," McFadden instructed, and they made the final leap to the last car in the row. There were zombies 4 deep on the other side, pressing against the cars, trying to get to them. Another 100 or so ghouls were in their field of vision past them, but they were spread out a lot better. The corporal looked into the distance and spotted a construction zone another block up. "Hell yeah," he said. There was a cinder block skeleton of a building with one large opening where a set of double doors would be installed. It was on the side of the building facing them, with no other entrances on the side to the right. "Hell yeah," Green huffed. McFadden pointed up the road. "When we jump, head to that construction zone on the left," he instructed. Green nodded. "And then what?" he asked. "Find something to bunch them up in that entrance," McFadden said. "Should give us time to escape into the residential neighborhood." The private took a deep breath. "Good a plan as any," he said. "You ready?" McFadden nodded, and the two of them prepared to make the jump. They took out their handguns and fired a few point-blank range shots into the heads of the ghouls directly behind them by the cars, allowing them to back up as far as they could to take a run at it. They made their move, pushing off from the roof as hard as they could. The soldiers flew through the air over the outstretched arms of the hungry horde. When they cleared them, they landed hard on the ground and rolled forward. They scrambled quickly to their feet, stumbling forward again before getting moving again. As they ran, they fired off a few more shots, taking out the zombies directly in front of them. With the path clear to the construction site, they moved quickly, swiftly reaching the entrance. They stopped to take stock of the situation, glancing back at the mob of ghouls quickly forming behind them. It was easily a couple hundred and growing, all heading their way and about 30 yards away. 45 seconds at the most, Green said. "What are we doing?" The corporal didn't respond, just continued surveying the area. Finally, he honed in on a pile of long rebar, maybe 20 yards long. "There," he said. "Rebar?" Green asked. The corporal took off, the private hot on his heels. "Yep, get a piece of the long stuff," McFadden instructed. They each grabbed a piece, and it was wobbly and heavy, unwieldy. "Now what?" Green huffed. "Get it about chest height on one side of the door," McFadden said. "I'll take the other side." Green was confused, but followed the order. They got in position, the tip of the rebar chest high. McFadden positioned his so that the back end near him dug into the ground for added leverage. Green did the same, and then they waited. Several seconds went by before the first few zombies were within view. They led a pack of hundreds directly behind them. When they began pushing through the door, shoulder to shoulder, their chests pressed up against the rebar. It didn't take long for the metal to pierce the rotting flesh. The weight of the mob behind the lead creatures shoved them forward, pressing the rebar completely through them and into the second zombie. This continued as the ghouls tried to get to the soldiers in the middle of the construction zone. It didn't take long before there were half a dozen zombies on each piece of rebar. They were wide enough to block the entrance of the door, which meant the only option for getting in meant getting pierced by the metal. "Okay, we're catching some. Then what?" Green said. "Just wait and hold position," the corporal replied. The private shook his head, not sure how to react to his superior, but did as he was ordered. More time went by and the zombies continued to get onto the rebar, with a good 12 yards of them pushing up on the metal, getting closer to the soldiers. Finally, McFadden let go of his and smiled when the rebar stayed in place. Green watched and then did the same gingerly, but the zombies continued to move forward on his side. McFadden drew his knife, walking up to the lead zombie and jamming it into his eye. As it dropped down limp, he did the same to the next 5 in the line. Green did the same, quickly knocking down the front end of the zombie conga line. They got to about 7 before stopping, the front end of the rebar collapsing to the ground and not moving. The 2 men stood there for a moment, watching the entrance. The mass of rotting flesh continued to push forward, but they couldn't get enough leverage to get inside. "That's a hell of a blockade, Corporal," Green said with awe in his voice. "Wonder how long it will hold." "Long enough for us to make our exit," McFadden said, and glanced towards the back exit where there were no zombies. "No noise from here on out. There's a residential neighborhood a couple blocks up. Let's get moving." The 2 men ran to the exit, glancing both ways and seeing no zombies. They darted across the street towards the neighborhood and what they hoped would be a chance to regroup. Chapter 5. Rabin drove the group through the line of vehicles on the road, which had stretched on for miles. It was the same story as they went, death and destruction as far as the eye could see. Corpses everywhere, but only a small handful of zombies moving. "This place better be close," the private muttered. "I'm tired of seeing this carnage." "Better get used to it," Caldwell quipped, "because this place is home for quite a while." Rabin shook his head, clearly disgusted at the thought. He slowed down when he spotted a large 3-story building in the distance. He stopped about a quarter mile from the main road it was on, letting out a sigh as he did. "It's just keep on coming," he muttered. The people in the back leaned towards the center of the vehicle, looking through the center to see what the soldier was on about. The building was surrounded by a large chain-link fence with barbed wire around it. The front gate hung by a thread, smashed open with a vehicle that was burned out halfway into the parking lot. Bodies littered the ground everywhere, as well as hanging out of the blown-out windows on the ground floor. Zombies roamed freely, inside and outside the building. They could see several dozen from their vantage point, but there were likely a lot more inside. "Well, Sarge," Haddon said with a sigh, "looks like we're in for a fight." "We can fight if we need to, Sergeant," Kevin piped up. Caldwell grunted. "Looks like you might have to, because I'm not sure we want to be using our guns," he admitted. "We're too close to downtown still. It would be one thing if that building was secure, but it's nowhere close." "Really, Sarge?" Rabin gasped. "You want to fight these things hand to hand?" "Don't want to," he quipped, "but I'd rather fight a few of them hand to hand than a shitload of them with weapons hot, especially in that building." "Do we even have hand-to-hand weapons?" Schuyler piped up. "You guys have knives, but what about us?" Caldwell looked around at the vehicles nearby. "Gotta be some tire irons in those trunks. Let's get 'em," he suggested, and got out. Haddon followed him, walking over to a sedan that was off the road. They looked inside, spotting a bullet wound in the driver's head that looked to have come straight through the windshield. "Is he moving?" the private asked. They stared for a moment, but nothing happened. "Doesn't look like it," Caldwell replied. They scanned the rest of the vehicle before trying the door, which was locked. The sergeant used the butt of his rifle to smash the glass, reaching inside and popping the trunk. He walked back there and tossed out a suitcase, reaching for the spare tire kit. He pulled out a tire iron, showing it to the oil workers before moving on to the next one. Haddon led the way to the truck behind them, which had a tool chest in the back. There were bullet holes in the windshield, but the door was open, and someone sprawled on the ground a few yards away. Bullet holes sprayed their back as if they'd been gunned down while running away. "What the hell happened here, Sarge?" Haddon breathed. "I don't know," Caldwell replied quietly. "But I'm guessing we're going to find our answers in the building up there." He used the tire iron to pop the lock on the toolbox on the back of the truck. They found a crowbar and a couple of large wrenches. "This will have to do," he said. "Let's get 'em ready to move." Haddon let out a whistle and motioned for everyone to get out of the truck. When everyone congregated, Caldwell handed out the weapons to the oil workers. They inspected them, but nobody looked entirely thrilled with the situation. "Okay, here's the plan," Caldwell spoke up. "Rabin and I are going to lead the way in. Haddon will bring up the rear with you four in the middle. You are only to step in if we call for you. Understood?" The 4 oil workers nodded in agreement. "Rabin, you have a flashlight?" Caldwell asked. Rabin nodded, as did Haddon, who held up his. "Nobody fires their weapon," the sergeant warned again. Skylar raised her hand. "What about once we're inside?" she asked. "Those walls are insulated to deal with the cold weather up here. Should be enough to muffle the sound, shouldn't it?" "I'm with her on this one, Sarge," Rabin added. "They're spread out pretty good out here. They could be dense as fuck inside." "Not to mention tight quarters," Kevin added. Caldwell contemplated a moment before finally nodding. "Last resort, single shots only," he said firmly. "And make damn sure you don't miss." Everybody nodded as Caldwell got to the front of the pack, leading them out. The group walked down the middle of the road, the soldiers completely focused on the task at hand, but the oil workers took glances to the side at the death and carnage. Haddon noticed and shook his head. "Don't worry about them," he said. "They can't be helped. Stay focused on what we have to do." The workers nodded in agreement as they continued to march towards the building. When they were within 100 yards of the building, Caldwell stopped them just before the street. He turned around, glancing at Gerald, and motioned for his crowbar. "May I borrow that for a moment?" he asked. Gerald nodded and held it out. The sergeant took it and smacked it on the ground a couple of times. Loud metallic pinging echoed throughout the air, garnering the attention of several zombies at the edge of the lot. They started moaning and coming their way. "Thank you," Caldwell said and handed the crowbar back. Gerald nodded, though his eyes were wide with confusion and fear as he looked at what was now coming their way. "Stay 5 yards behind us," the sergeant instructed. "Don't want to catch you in a backswing." The workers nodded and let Caldwell and Rabin walk up first before trailing behind. "Take out the ones who are apart from the others quickly," the sergeant instructed. "Then knock the others down if they start bunching up. We have help, let's use it." "Works for me," Rabin said. The 2 soldiers met the first wave of zombies in the road, delivering knife strikes to the heads and tossing the limp corpses to the side. Half a dozen ghouls staggered around the entrance to the parking lot, bunched up a bit. Caldwell and Rabin built up a head of steam, lowering their shoulders and smashing a couple of zombies into the others, sending a few to the ground and the rest stumbling backwards. They leapt over the ones on the ground, focused on the one still standing. "Take care of them," Caldwell barked. The oil workers behind started smashing skulls, frantically swinging their weapons with very little accuracy. However, with the ghouls on the ground, they got the job done okay. While they worked, the soldiers in front of them got to work on the 3 remaining. Rabin stabbed his in the face, dropping it. Caldwell faced down 2 of them, positioning one in front of the other and stabbing quickly. One fell, and the one behind it was immediately stabbed. "Everybody good?" Caldwell asked when it seemed they were finished. There was a chorus in the affirmative, and he gripped his knife tightly. "Good, because we're just getting started," he said. There were another dozen or so zombies in the parking lot that they could see, with a few more emerging from behind the burned-out building. Their moans filled the air, causing more to pour out from the broken windows on the first floor of the building. Caldwell and Rabin gripped their knives tightly as the mob started to move their way. They looked past the ones in the parking lot and saw a throng coming out of the windows. "Sarge, we're not going to be able to stab our way out of this," Rabin warned. Caldwell surveyed the situation and knew that Rabin was right. There were just too many of them. He looked over at the private, then back at the terrified oil workers. He was out of options. "Haddon, on me," he said. "Schuyler, watch our 6. Haddon came up next to him, readying his assault rifle, when he noticed the other 2 holding theirs. "We mow through them and get inside," Caldwell said. "As soon as things are secure, Rabin, I want you to run back to the truck and use it to block off the entrance. It's not going to get everything, but it'll at least slow them down." Rabin nodded as the sergeant raised his rifle, the privates following suit. "Cut 'em down!" Caldwell barked. The 3 soldiers opened fire, quickly shredding through the zombies in the lot. Their heads exploded before the limp bodies hit the ground. Within a few seconds, the lot was clear, so they turned their attention towards the ones coming out of the building. They marched up, aiming carefully and firing. One shot right after the other, taking down a zombie with precision. It was a slaughter as the highly trained soldiers eliminated the ghouls. Finally, there were no more coming out of the building, allowing them to catch their breath. "Rabin, get the truck," Caldwell instructed. "We're going to secure the 1st floor." "Yes, sir," the private replied, and ran off. Haddon and Caldwell got ready to work their way into the building. There was broken glass all over the ground, as well as a lot of dried blood. The first office looked like it had been ransacked. Desks were overturned, blood splattered all over the walls, and several people lay dead, frozen in position. Haddon walked over to inspect one of the bodies to make sure they were actually dead. "Sarge," he said. Caldwell came over and looked at the 3 corpses, dressed in business suits with their hands bound and their throats slit. "Guess HR couldn't fix their problem," Haddon quipped. Caldwell glared at him and then moved back into position. He reached a door to a small office, amazingly still closed and on its hinges. He nodded to the people behind him, letting them know he was about to open the door. As soon as he turned the knob, several zombies smacked into it, trying to get at them. Haddon fired several shots through the wood, sending bodies to the floor with loud thumps on the other side. Caldwell latched the door shut again and breathed heavily for a moment, before turning to Haddon. "Nice shooting, Tex," he said. "You want to finish them off here?" the private asked, inclining his head towards the door. "Or go around to the next office?" "Next office," the sergeant replied, and walked over to the next door, stepping carefully over the broken glass. It looked like a war zone in there, with several dead people strewn about. One lady lay face up on a desk with a letter opener lodged in her neck. Another man slumped over a desk, the back of his head caved in with a paperweight. The soldiers ignored it for the time being, staying focused on the task at hand. Caldwell gently turned the knob, bracing for an impact that didn't come. He peeked out, looking towards the office they'd just come from, with a half-dozen zombies still trying to get in. As he shut the door, everyone jumped as Rabin entered, stomping on some glass and causing a loud noise. "Jesus, ever-loving Christ, Rabin!" Haddon barked. "How about announcing your presence?" "My bad," the private quipped. "Everything okay here?" Caldwell inclined his head. "Got half a dozen a few yards away," he said. "Haddon and I will take them out. You cover the other way." "And us?" Eugene asked. "Hang tight until we clear the hallway," Caldwell instructed. The group nodded as the soldiers got into position. The sergeant opened the door carefully, stepping out into the hallway along with Haddon and Rabin. Once in position, Caldwell clicked on his flashlight to show the enemy, and they opened fire. It only took a matter of seconds to eliminate the threat. "Clear," Caldwell said. The oil workers emerged from the room and took stock of the carnage. A long hallway led back towards the main entrance of the building. Caldwell used his flashlight to lead the way, with Rabin watching the rear. When they reached the entrance, the front doors were boarded up and blocked with desks. However, there was a hole in the barricade that led to the outside. A few dead bodies lay there, facing inward, as if they'd been gunned down trying to storm the place. Caldwell moved his light around the room, showing more bodies leading up towards a large master staircase that led up to the 2nd floor. He motioned for the group to follow. When they got to the top of the stairs, they looked around. Bullet casings littered the floor, along with lots of blood and the occasional body. They followed the trail of gore up to the 3rd floor, which was as high as the staircase went. They stood in a large open area leading back to the front of the building, with a broken set of double doors. A dozen or so bodies were strewn across the floor, ripped to shreds by bullets. By the door lay a decapitated body wearing a security vest. The soldiers carefully pushed the doors open, leading into a large office. There was only one body on the floor in there, that of another security guard. He was missing an arm and had numerous stab wounds all over his face and neck. Caldwell walked over to the desk where a heavy-set man in a sweater vest sat. Dozens of stab wounds on his body, his throat slit. A knife was lodged in his chest, holding a small piece of paper in place. The sergeant tugged on the paper, holding it up with his flashlight. He shook his head. "What does it say?" Schuyler whispered. "It says, 'This is what you get for not sharing,'" Caldwell replied. "Sharing what?" Haddon wondered. "This is an oil company. It's not like they have gas for them to fill up their cars so they can drive to God only knows where." Gerald shrugged. "No, but they might have food," he suggested. "Building this size? Stands to reason they'd have a cafeteria," Rabin agreed. "Not sure it's worth killing over or not, though." Kevin shook his head. "No, but they might have food reserves," he said. "Climate like this, if one of your crew has to fix a problem in the field, there's a good chance they're going to be out there a while." "And as we always say," Eugene added, "a fed crew is a happy crew." "Plus they're most likely MREs," Schuyler said. "They're cheaper and would last longer." Gerald nodded, pointing at her in agreement. "And oil companies aren't exactly known for splurging on amenities," he said. "So they're going the cheapest way possible." "That explains why the company would be fighting so hard to hold on to them," Caldwell said. "And why people were desperate to get to them," Kevin added. Gerald sighed. "Now we just have to hope they didn't," he muttered. "Okay, but where would they keep the stuff?" Rabin asked. Caldwell looked at the walls. They were lined with awards, certificates, and news articles. On the far wall stood a whiteboard with a map attached. He walked over and pulled the paper down, studying the oil fields that had circles over them. "Not sure, but we need to hold on to this map," he said. Schuyler and Kevin walked up to the whiteboard and studied the information there. "Looks like field info," she said. Rabin sidled up next to her. "Is it good news?" he asked. Kevin shrugged, glancing at Schuyler, and she returned the gesture. "Too soon to tell," he admitted. "We're going to have to confer with the map." "You two stay here and work on that," Caldwell said, and inclined his head to Haddon. "You stay with them." The private nodded and took up position by the door as the two oil riggers began to confer over the information presented to them. The others walked out of the office and back towards the stairs, down to the 2nd floor. There was a hallway there that led further back into the building. They walked a little ways before they reached a set of heavy curtains. "Huh?" Rabin murmured. "I would have thought this building went back further." Caldwell pursed his lips. "Pretty sure it does," he said, and opened the curtain. Behind it stood glass, a window that overlooked a large warehouse area. There were skylights in the ceiling that provided natural light, which was both a blessing and a curse. There were tons of machines down there, with crates of spare parts and pallets of goods, as well as vehicles. There were also about 100 zombies roaming the floor, with only a handful of blood patches and no corpses on the ground. "First floor, now!" Caldwell barked, and turned on his heel quickly. He led the group racing downstairs, the soldiers before the oil workers. They reached the bottom and skidded around the corner, turning back towards the warehouse and racing towards the doors. The sergeant shone his flashlight on it, relieved to see it was securely shut. A head sat on the floor in front of the doors. Caldwell walked cautiously towards it, leaning over to inspect it. A trail of blood ran down half of the door, with the severed head clear at the neck. A bullet hole in the forehead. "What the hell happened here?" Gerald breathed. Rabin walked to the side, pulling back a curtain on one side of the door at the headless corpse on the other. "If I had to guess," he said, as he let the curtain drop, There were a couple of those things in the warehouse that they had contained. When the civilian invaders broke in, they got a surprise. Our headless friend there was apparently the last one to make it out, at least partially. On the plus side of things, it doesn't look like they were able to get anything out of there before being overrun with zombies. Caldwell sighed. Yeah, but on the downside, we have to get in there, he said. Because if there isn't food in there, then this mission just got a whole lot more difficult. Chapter 6. McFadden and Green jimmied the lock on the back door of a house. Green finally got it and slid open the glass door. McFadden went in, knife raised, handgun in his offhand. Green shut the door behind him and secured it before joining him in the sweep. They moved swiftly through the house, finding that nobody was home. "We're clear," Green called from his area. "Clear," the corporal called back. "Now let's see if there's anything left in this one." They went into the kitchen, opening up the pantry door and the cabinets. With each opening, they echoed exasperated sighs. Green opened the final cabinet and got excited when he spotted a box, but then groaned in frustration and slammed the door when he realized it was powdered dish soap. "God damn it," he barked. "This is the 5th house that has been picked clean. Forget food, they even took out the basic ingredients for food. How fucking bad was it here that someone thought they had to eat a fistful of oregano?" McFadden cocked a brow. "You done?" he asked dryly. Green took a deep breath and then nodded. "Yeah, sorry, Corporal," he said. "I just don't have a good feeling about this." "Join the club, Private," McFadden replied. "There's still another couple of blocks of houses. Let's hit a few more, and if there's nothing, then we can assume they've all been picked clean." Green sighed. "Not like we have anything else to do," he muttered. "That's the spirit," the corporal quipped, and then opened his communicator. "Murray, you copy?" "I'm here, Corporal." Murray came back immediately. "We're striking out so far," McFadden said. "We're going to hit a few more houses. Then we'll need a pickup. You got anything?" "Negative," the soldier replied. "Few stragglers roaming around. Past a grocery store that was burned to the ground, so can't imagine anything is in there. Any place that looks like it might have had food has long since been ransacked." The corporal sighed. "All right. Seems to be the way things are going," he replied. "Keep an eye out for trouble, and wait on my call." "Copy that," Murray said. McFadden took a deep breath. "Come on, Green. Let's hit the next house," he said. The duo stepped outside, walking across the backyard to the house directly across from it. "So, how much food do we have in the plane?" Green asked. "They did send us with food, didn't they?" McFadden wrinkled his nose. "Yeah, but you're probably not going to like the answer," he said. "That bad?" Green asked with a wince. The corporal sighed. "We have a month's worth of food," he replied. "Maybe 6 weeks if we ration properly." Green cocked a brow. "But that's plenty of time to get the oil flowing again, right?" he asked, confused. "They can run supply drops to us." McFadden shook his head. "Even if we get the oil flowing and the pipeline is clear, it's going to take time to refine it," he explained. "And I don't know what all goes into it, but who knows if they can even get the proper type for planes." The private grunted. "You telling me if we don't find food we're fucked?" he asked. "I'm saying it would make life a lot easier if we find something," the corporal replied. "What about the greenhouse Sarge talked about?" Green asked. McFadden shook his head. "That's a long-term solution," he said. "Gotta survive that long for stuff to grow. Plus, with the state of this town, who the hell knows if there's anything left up there?" The private pursed his lips, dejected as they reached the next house. He popped the lock open on the back door, and they went inside, quickly sweeping the place and finding no threats. "Clear," McFadden called. "Yeah, clear," Green called back, though some of the life had gone out of his voice. He opened all the kitchen cabinets, finding them bare. He didn't speak, just shook his head, going through the motions, even though it was clear there would be nothing. "You know, I said we'd check some more houses, but honestly, what's the point?" McFadden asked with a sigh. Green shrugged. Well, you think we should put ourselves out of our misery and head towards the greenhouse? He asked. Fuck it, might as well, the corporal agreed. The soldiers went out the back door and were startled by a zombie coming around the corner of the house. Green leapt forward and stabbed it in the head, taking his frustrations out as he kicked it to the ground. As soon as the corpse hit the grass, a few more ghouls staggered around the corner, and their moans triggered even more that echoed from around the other side of the house. How do you feel about retreating? He asked. McFadden nodded. Pretty damn good at this point, he agreed. The duo jogged in the other direction, away from the growing threat. When they glanced over their shoulders, a few dozen ghouls shambled after them, pouring onto the road. McFadden slapped his communicator. Murray, we're ready for that pickup now, he said. Where? Came the reply. East side of the neighborhood, the corporal replied. About 7-8 blocks north of the main road. On my way, Murray said. The two soldiers jogged a little more before slowing to a steady walk, with the immediate threat behind them. It's like a shitty funhouse out here, Green quipped. Every time we turn around, there's another pack of those things. As soon as he finished speaking, moans filled the air to the south, and they turned around to see that the mob from the main road was about 30 yards away. Hundreds of ghouls walked towards them. The soldiers stood there for a moment, completely stunned. Green, you're not allowed to talk anymore, McFadden breathed. The private nodded. Yeah, that's fair, he agreed. They picked up the pace, rushing towards the meeting point. The zombies were in hot pursuit, filling in behind them, but luckily not stretching too far along the road, running parallel to them. Murray, we're going to be coming in hot. You'd better be ready, McFadden warned. Just get there, Corporal, came the urgent reply. The soldiers ran faster, rushing through the yards as the zombies pursued them. They finally reached the end of the neighborhood, standing on the street and looking back towards the main road, and their hearts sank. A row of zombies 8 to 10 deep stretched across the road. Murray, where are you at? McFadden cried. A few seconds later, an engine roared and tires squealed, and Murray's truck burst through the mob. Bodies flew through the air, some crushed beneath the tires, one ghoul getting trapped in the wheel well on the front driver's side. It wedged in there, locking the tire and sending the truck swerving back and forth. They watched in horror as the truck dipped into a ditch, flipping over. The bodies caught on the front of the grill went flying through the air as the truck landed on its roof. Fuck! McFadden screamed, and the duo tore towards their comrade as a mob of ghouls came up on the truck. Several creatures grew closer, and the corporal opened fire, hitting a few of them in the head and buying them a few seconds. Get his ass out of there, he barked. I'll hold the line. He took up position in the road a few yards away from the wreck, popping off round after round, carefully placed to hit the ghouls that came within 15 yards. Green rushed towards the truck, being forced to jump back as the zombie trapped in the wheel well reached out at him, thrashing around and trying to grab him. He looked at the mangled mass of dead flesh and quickly put a bullet in its head before ducking down and looking into the cab. Murray was in rough shape, bleeding from the head, and a bit dazed, but still moving. Still with me there, Murray? Green called. Huh? The other soldier groaned. Yeah, I don't know what happened. Zombie fucked your truck up good, but you're gonna be okay, Green assured him. Murray looked around, brow furrowed. What's all that firing? He asked. That's McFadden making sure we don't get eaten, Green explained. Now come on, we gotta move. Can you undo your seatbelt? Murray tried to unlatch the belt, but it was locked up. He shook his head. Won't open, he said. Green drew his knife and reached into the truck. Don't move, he warned, and made quick work cutting through the belt, sending Murray crashing to the ground in a heap. He grunted in pain as Green dragged him out of the truck. I know it hurts, buddy, but we gotta move, Green said. Hurry it up, McFadden barked. Green managed to get Murray to his feet and hooked an arm over his shoulder. We're clear, he called. McFadden, having to take a few steps back as the zombies got too close to his position, finally rushed back, putting Murray's other arm around his shoulder to help him move. They ran as quickly as they could away from the mob, but the horde of zombies was filtering out of the neighborhood quickly. They stopped in the road, looking around. Green spotted a 2-story building the next block up. "Hotel, next corner," he cried. The 3 of them moved as fast as they could, with Murray in the middle, his feet finally starting to find their purchase as he came out of his daze. By the time they got to the parking lot, the ghouls from the neighborhood were only about 20 yards away. They rushed up to the doors, finding them wide open. They quickly rushed inside, looking around for something to barricade them with, but no luck. "How the hell is there no furniture in here?" Green cried. McFadden shook his head. "Because it's bolted to the goddamn walls," he growled. He kicked the booth closest to him that was built into the wall, and then ran back to the door. He hoped there was some kind of lock he could flip, but it needed a key. Through the window, the zombies were within 10 yards. He whipped around, spotting a set of stairs to the right leading up to the second floor. "Get to higher ground," he instructed. Green and Murray worked their way up the stairs, the former with his weapon at the ready, and the latter just struggling to make it up by himself. Finally, they reached the second floor, and Green disappeared down the hallway to clear it. A moment later, he came back to the landing. "We're clear, Corporal," he called. McFadden backed away from the door, watching as the horde reached it. They'd breach quickly. There was nothing he could do to stop it. He turned and took the stairs up 2 at a time. "Gonna be a hell of a last stand," Green said. "Well, I got 2 more mags on me," the corporal quipped, "so not gonna be much of one." The trio looked around for options. Green tried one of the doors, but it was locked. He jiggled the handle, but it didn't move. "One of those keycard deals?" he said. McFadden cocked his head. "Shoot it open?" he suggested. "Not likely," Green replied, shaking his head. "Those things are well built." "The roof," Murray stammered. The soldiers turned to face him, and he pointed to a door at the end of the hall that said "Roof Access." The door had a regular lock on it. "Get it open!" McFadden barked. Green ran down, aiming his assault rifle at the mechanism, and opened fire. The handle was obliterated, and he had to reach inside and manually open it up. Inside, there was a ladder leading up. "We're in business!" he cried. "Get Murray up there," McFadden instructed, and then turned as the zombies poured into the lobby. He shot down the stairs, picking off lead zombies and creating some obstacles for them. This bought them precious seconds for the privates to make it up to the roof. McFadden burned through another magazine's worth of ammunition, and then turned and started running towards the ladder. He reached it and looked back as the mob reached the second floor. He hurried up and leapt onto the roof, slamming the hatch shut behind him. He looked around and spotted the other 2 at the front of the building. Green turned back and waved to him. "You gotta see this," he said. McFadden headed over and then gasped at the sight. There were easily 2,000 zombies pushing their way into this hotel, covering the entirety of the streets. "Good a time as any to call it in," he muttered, and then dialed in his communicator. "Sergeant Caldwell, do you copy?" he asked. There were a few moments of silence where the only noise were the moans of the seat of rotting flesh below. "McFadden," Caldwell came back. "What's your status?" The corporal took a deep breath. "Currently camping out on top of a hotel," he said. "Gonna assume there's a good reason?" the sergeant asked. McFadden held out the radio so the moans would go through the receiver. "You could say that," he said. "Sounds like we have a crowd," Caldwell said. "How many we talking?" The corporal tilted his head back and forth. "Couple thousand, if we're lucky," he reported. "Sit tight," Caldwell replied. "We'll get something figured out." "Yes, sir," McFadden said, and then did just that, taking a seat on the cold ground. "Man, can't anything go right today?" Green huffed as he sat down next to Murray. "Greenhouse," Murray murmured. The corporal cocked his head. "What about the greenhouse?" he asked. "It's still there," Murray replied. "Couple windows busted, but everything else is still there." Green let out a deep sigh of relief. "Okay, that's one thing," he admitted. "How the hell we getting out of here, though?" McFadden raised his chin and said firmly, "Sarge will come up with something." Chapter 7. "I have no idea how the fuck we're gonna pull this off," Caldwell said, standing outside of the warehouse windows on the second floor as he looked inside. Dozens of zombies milled about, blissfully unaware of their presence, and those were only the ones they could see.
"Not the most encouraging of speeches there, Caldwell," Schuyler said dryly.
"Just being honest," the sergeant admitted. "Getting to McFadden is going to be a bitch, but we have to deal with this first. There's one door to get in from inside the building." Rabin raised his hand.
"So we go in through the outside?"
he suggested. Caldwell shook his head. "Do you really want to risk opening ourselves up to a two-front war?" he asked. "Few shots go off, and God only knows what comes our way from the wilderness. Maybe the out-of-gas convoy outside of town didn't get bullets. They got teeth." Rabin pursed his lips and then nodded in agreement. "Sarge, we're good enough to get through the door," Haddon pointed out. Rabin shook his head. "Yeah, and then what, though?" he asked.
"Close quarters combat with 100 of those things, that's what."
"Not if we're smart about it," Haddon shot back with a shrug.
"Oh, Lord, Haddon has a thought,"
Rabin drawled, rolling his eyes. "We're fucked." The other soldier glared at him, and then bumped his shoulder as he turned to the window, pointing as he spoke. "The door is right in the center of the space," he began. "We silent kill our way in and work our way over to the left down that line of boxes. We take cover over there and stay silent. Then you four break the window on the rightmost side and raise some hell. Fire off a few shots, whatever it takes. That should draw the whole crowd over to you." Caldwell nodded. "Giving us a chance to take up positions behind them," he continued, and then pointed to some large vehicles in the back, "and up on top for safety." Haddon grinned. "Then it's just a matter of picking them off," he finished. "Either with bullets or a spear if we can find the material." "I saw some folding tables that looked decades old," Kevin said, jerking a thumb over his shoulder. "Pretty sure I can get those metal supports off. Give you something." Caldwell nodded. "Kevin, Eugene, make that happen, please," he instructed. The two men nodded and rushed off back down the hallway to the first floor to get to work. "While they're busy with that, did you find anything out about the oil field, Schuyler?" the sergeant asked.
She nodded. "Looks like 3 of the biggest ones were in operating condition a month or so ago when this all hit," she said.
"Is that good or bad?" Caldwell asked. She shrugged.
"Depends if they're still going," she said. "In theory it's good because the others were shut down for the winter, so there's little chance they were damaged by running on their own without supervision."
"And who knows, maybe we'll get lucky and the one still going will be fine," Gerald said. Rabin pointed to the factory.
"Right, because we've had so much luck so far this trip," he quipped.
Gerald crossed his arms. "Anybody ever tell you that you're a negative Nancy?" he asked. Rabin shrugged.
"Nah, just being realistic," he said.
"Come on, let's get into position," Caldwell said. A few minutes went by as everyone got ready to go. The trio of soldiers stood by the door, and oil workers stayed upstairs, ready to breach the window. Caldwell used his communicator, one of which they'd given to Schuyler. "We're in position," he said. "Are you guys ready up there?" There was a fumbling noise as she maybe figured out how to use it, and then finally she said,
"We're ready. Just give us the word and we'll raise a ruckus."
"Stand by," Caldwell replied, and then got into position at the door. Haddon stood behind him with all 3 makeshift spears created from the folding table supports. They were about 4 feet long with a crudely filed down tip. Rabin stood to the right, peeking through the window.
"We have 3 right by the door,"
he murmured, and adjusted so he could see the other.
4 more to the right, several yards away.
"And to the left?" Caldwell asked. Rabin shook his head.
"Can't see, too dark," he said. "Those boxes are blocking the light. I'm sure we'll find out soon enough, though."
"Come on, let's get into position," the sergeant said. Rabin approached the door, grabbing the knob and waiting for Caldwell to give him the signal. The sergeant nodded, and then chaos ensued.
As soon as the door opened, Caldwell darted inside, jamming his blade into the back of an unsuspecting zombie's skull. He shoved it forward, into the other two by the door, sending them to the ground. Caldwell turned back to see if there was a threat behind him, and there was. 5 ghouls packed in tight, slowly coming towards him. There were large wooden boxes lining the floor, creating a hallway that stretched on for 30 or 40 yards. "Shit," he muttered. Haddon followed him in, stopping right at the entrance and surveying the situation. Rabin was close behind, shutting the door behind him and making sure it was secure. He turned and saw the ghouls, and then looked to the sergeant for instructions. Caldwell dealt with the zombies on the ground, buying them a few moments as the other nearby ghouls came their way. "Give me one of those," Rabin hissed, and grabbed one of the 4-foot-long spears from Haddon, readying it like he was a Spartan. He let out a grunt and leapt forward, impaling the first ghoul in the tight hallway right through the chest. He kept pushing until his hands that gripped the spear tightly met the rotting flesh. His momentum shoved the zombie back into the next one, impaling it as well. The front ghoul was within a couple of feet of Rabin, thrashing about, trying to get a hold of him, but Rabin kept pushing. He put his head down and pumped his legs. "Sarge, we're moving," Haddon hissed. Caldwell turned and saw Rabin was clearing the way for them, and they followed quickly. Rabin had 3 zombies on his spear, and the weight of them started to slow him down. He was almost completely stopped when the other 2 came up behind him, pushing him forward. The increased weight of the trio was enough to force the 3 ghouls on the spear back into the other ones. They got 30 yards down the faux hallway, clearing the row of boxes and getting to a main aisle of the warehouse. Caldwell jammed his knife into the zombie closest to Rabin, ending the threat. Rabin tossed the corpse backwards and upwards onto the ghouls behind it, buying them a few precious moments. They ran down the main aisle, a couple dozen creatures straight ahead. The soldiers darted down a side aisle, towards their hiding spot. As they came around the corner, a zombie reached up at them from the ground, missing a significant portion of its legs and unable to stand. Rabin fell face first as the creature grabbed onto his ankle. Before it could bite, however, Haddon jammed the 2 remaining spears into the top of the ghoul's head, ending the threat. Its hand went limp, releasing Rabin, who nodded his thanks, not wanting to make any noise. They reached their hiding spot amongst several boxes. They could hear the shuffling of feet and moaning around them, starting to get closer. Caldwell clicked on the communicator, speaking softly. "Now," he whispered. A couple seconds later, the glass above the factory floor shattered. Several gunshots echoed, followed by screaming. The trio of soldiers listened carefully for the moans and shuffling of feet, which got quieter and quieter. They gave it a couple of minutes as the screaming continued from the window. The moans were loud, but all coming from the other side of the warehouse. Caldwell motioned for the others to follow. They came out of hiding, cautiously making their way back to the aisle leading to the other side of the space. They reached the corner, and the sergeant peeked out. He was relieved to note there weren't any creatures on that side. They walked slowly but deliberately, keeping their footfalls as quiet as possible. They paused at each crossing, looking towards the other aisle on the side where the oil workers were creating a ruckus. Caldwell looked up to Skylar, and she tapped her communicator. "You're clear from what I can see," she said. He gave her a thumbs up, and the soldiers moved quickly to the back of the space. They cut across to the other main aisle, finding their spot. It was a large flatbed truck with boxes of spare parts for the rigs on the back. The truck was several feet off of the ground, making any potential threat from zombies non-existent. They climbed up, Rabin and Haddon getting their spears, and Caldwell readying his rifle. "All right, going to fire a few shots and get them coming our way. Then it's stabbing time," the sergeant said. "Skylar, we're in position. You can stop the noise." "Good luck," she came through. He took aim at the mass of ghouls in front of him, a good 60 or 70 yards away. He fired, hitting one in the back of the head. The gunshot echo filled the silent void. He squeezed off a few more rounds, making sure he had all the mob's attention. Soon the mass of rotting flesh was coming their way, shuffling and moaning at the sight of a fresh meal. As they passed through the direct beams of sunlight, they got a better look at them. Some looked like warehouse workers. Others were a mix of men, women, and children that looked like they might have broken in looking for food and met a messy end.
"Doesn't look like it's more than 100 or so," Haddon said. "Shouldn't be too difficult to take them out."
"Let's hope so," Caldwell said, "because we have to figure out a way to get McFadden and those guys."
"If you want to start working on that little problem, Sarge, we can handle this mob," Rabin suggested. "Just going to take a few minutes."
The sergeant asked. "All right," he conceded. "If you need anything, just holler." He walked over to a nearby crate, hopping up onto it and sitting down, taking a breather. He switched the comm frequency and dialed up McFadden. "Corporal, how's your situation?" he asked.
"Still sitting on the roof, soaking up some rays," McFadden drawled. "Listening to the deafening roar or moans. You?"
Caldwell watched the shuffling zombies.
"We're solid over here, just clearing out the mob in the warehouse," he replied. "We'll have this building secure and hope to God there's some food in here." "Good to hear," McFadden said. "So, changing topics a bit, have you figured out a way to get us the fuck out of here? As much as I love to get tan, I'd rather not die up here if I can help it."
Caldwell looked at the truck they were standing on before scanning the room a bit. There were 20-foot ladders stacked up in the corner, and a smile grew across his face.
"Hey, how tall is that building you're on?" Caldwell asked. "2 stories. Why?" McFadden asked.
The sergeant nodded thoughtfully.
"I think I got a way to get you down," he said. "Big truck plus a bigger ladder." "We can work with that, Sarge," McFadden said. "Say, don't suppose you boys have found anything flammable, have you?"
Caldwell looked around. "I mean, we're in an oil company warehouse," he replied. "Surely there has to be something dangerous around here. Why?"
"There's probably 1,000 of those things in the hotel we're on," the corporal replied. "The building is pretty far away from anything else, and the wind isn't terrible today. Figured a barbecue might be in order. It isn't going to completely solve our problem, but it'll take out a significant chunk of it."
Caldwell smirked, nodding before glancing at the privates, who were busy stabbing the first few ghouls that came into range.
"Hey, Rabin," Caldwell called. "McFadden wants to know if you want to start a giant-ass fire."
The private grinned.
"Hell yeah, I do," he cried. "Maybe we'll get lucky and find some marshmallows in the food stash."
"If only," Caldwell quipped. "Okay, McFadden, we got a working plan. Gonna be about an hour until we get there, so enjoy the sun while you can."
"We'll be here,"
the corporal promised. Caldwell clicked off his comm, standing up and walking over to the 2 privates who were still busy stabbing away. He tapped Rabin on the shoulder, motioning for him to hand over the spear.
"Take 5. Gotta keep those arms fresh," he suggested.
"We have a building to burn down after all." Chapter 8. McFadden, Green, and Murray continued to lounge around on the roof of the hotel. They sat there, staring out at the sea of rotting flesh, all moaning and pushing, trying to get into the building.
"You think they have any thoughts?"
Murray asked, out of the blue.
Green shook his head. "No, but I'm starting to think you may have gotten a concussion in that wreck," he quipped. "Asking questions like that."
"I'm serious," Murray replied, brow furrowing. "You think they have any thoughts?"
"About what?"
his companion countered, throwing up his hands.
"About how hungry they are? About their old lives? No, I don't think they have any thoughts at all. Just mindless ghouls with a primal need to eat us alive."
Murray rolled his eyes.
"What about you, Corporal?" he asked.
"I'm with Green," McFadden replied.
"I'm pretty sure you got a concussion."
The private huffed.
"I mean about—" "Yeah, I know what you meant," McFadden said with a wave of his hand. "If they do have any thoughts, it can't be anything more than food is over there. If they had any memory of their lives before, we would have seen some of them killing themselves, walking off a bridge, or some semblance of intelligence." He paused. "At least, I hope they don't have any thoughts like that, because if they do, I can't imagine a worse hell to be in." Green tilted his head back and forth. "I don't know. We are trapped in the middle of the Canadian wilderness surrounded by zombies, and very well could be on the verge of slowly starving to death," he mused.
Walking around in a daze just thinking about the good old days doesn't sound too terrible. I had 3 deployments over the last 7 years, McFadden said. Any memories of the good old days have either been knocked out with PTSD, or those brain cells have been eliminated thanks to industrial-strength tequila. Green nodded solemnly. Fair enough, he said. You had enough lounging around, McFadden? Caldwell's voice came through the communicator. There's work to be done. About damn time, the corporal muttered, and then hit his comm. What's the story, Sarge? He asked. The story is we're going to be coming at you from the north, Caldwell replied. Need to know if there is street access to the back of the building. The corporal got up and ran to the back of the building, looking over the edge. There was a small dirt clearing leading to the next road into a residential area. Yeah, there's a dirt path that looks like it cuts through the neighborhood, he said. You should be able to cut through there. Good, the sergeant replied. How's the front of the place looking? McFadden shook his head. Still looks like a Black Friday sale on crack, he replied dryly. They are making so much noise that they've got their undead buddies stretched back into the neighborhood. Couple thousand at least. Think that's the majority of them downtown? Caldwell asked. The corporal paused and then sighed. In my professional opinion, fuck if I know, he admitted. We had to run for our lives after only crossing the main road. There could be thousands more of those things downtown. But if they aren't coming out for this party, with as much noise as they're making, then they'll probably leave us alone until we want to bother them. Good enough for right now, the sergeant assured him. Get ready to move, because we're just around the corner. McFadden nodded firmly as he strode back over to the 2 privates. We'll be waiting. He held out his hand to help Murray up. Come on, buddy. We gotta get moving. Suits me, Murray groaned as he got to his feet. That constant moaning is getting on my last damn nerve. Well, if I know Sarge, we're gonna make him pay for your troubles, Green said. The 3 soldiers walked over to the back of the building, looking down and only seeing a few zombies in the back lot. A moment later, the roar of a powerful engine erupted, and a massive transport truck rumbled around back. Haddon stood in the back of the truck next to a lone crate and a couple of 20-foot ladders. Caldwell drove the truck alongside the back wall of the building, running over a zombie in the process. Haddon chuckled as the creature's head exploded underneath the large tire. Good one, Sarge, he quipped. The truck came to a stop and Haddon immediately started pulling the 20-foot ladder along the back of the wall. It clinked to the top, close to where the trio of soldiers stood. We're sending Murray down first, McFadden called. He's a little banged up. Yeah, ain't we all? Haddon drawled. Come on, let's move. He motioned towards the side of the building where the sound of the engine had alerted a few zombies to their presence. They can't get to you, can they? The corporal asked as he watched the ghouls stagger towards the truck. No, but enough of them can make it difficult to get out of here, Haddon quipped, and waved impatiently at them. McFadden nodded and helped Murray over the side. Move quickly. The private shimmied down the ladder, Green close behind him. As they went, McFadden held the top steady, keeping stock of the situation below. Zombies continued to come around the bend, but only a dozen or so were within 20 yards of the truck. Haddon, you get the flammable stuff like I asked? The corporal called. The private nodded. Yeah, I got a few 5-gallon containers of something that can burn quick, he replied. Don't know what it is, but they said we can live without it. Where you want it? The corporal waved to him. Get me 2 of them up here, quick, he said. Haddon sighed heavily and pointed out one of the containers to Green. The 2 men each grabbed a heavy canister and ascended the ladder, setting them down. Green, you're with me, McFadden said. Haddon, see if either of those rooms beside the ladder are clear. If they are, get in there and douse the door with the stuff. He paused, his gaze firm. Don't open the door under any circumstances. Those things are packed in tight. On it, Corporal, Haddon promised. Green and McFadden reached the front of the building, each holding a 5-gallon drum. What the hell are we doing, Corporal? Green asked. Fling whatever is in here as far out as you can, McFadden replied. I want to coat as many of these bastards as possible. The private contemplated for a moment before nodding, understanding what he was going for. They both ripped off the lids and steadied themselves before thrusting the container horizontally as hard as they could. A thin brown liquid flew through the air in a high arc, stretching out about 20 yards. After that, they followed it by tossing the containers over the edge into the mob below. They took a look at their handiwork, where the first couple dozen rows of ghouls were dark with liquid. "That should help spread the burn a bit," the corporal said, swiping his palms together. Green nodded. "It's a shame we can't get 'em all, though," he said. "That's going to suck, having to pick all those things off eventually." McFadden looked to the right at a thin stretch of pavement that led to the road. The majority of the zombies were directly in front of the building, attracted by the noise of the other zombies in front. "Honest opinion, Private," he mused. "You think we can get that truck through to the road on that sliver of pavement before the zombies completely cover it?" Green looked and then let out a low whistle as he considered it. "That's a bit tight for my taste, Corporal," he said. "Just like with your sex life, you gotta take what you can get," McFadden quipped, clapping him on the back. "I think we can make it." "But why?" Green asked, shaking his head. "What good is that going to do?" The corporal pointed. "Because with that truck, we can lure them to the outskirts of town," he said. "Lose 'em and let 'em wander into the Canadian wasteland." "Okay, that's a good plan and all, but why do we have to go that way?" Green asked. "Couldn't we just go the way Caldwell came in, backtrack, and honk the horn to get their attention?" McFadden paused and then wrinkled his nose in defeat. "Yeah, well, my way is more exciting," he muttered. "I accept your defeat," Green replied with a smirk. "Now come on, let's get the fuck out of here before we get overrun." The corporal pouted playfully as they ran back to the ladder. They looked over the edge as Haddon poked his head out the window below. "Primed and ready, Corporal," he called. "Now what?" "Let us get down to the truck, then light that bitch up," McFadden replied. "Yes, sir," Haddon said. The two soldiers hit the truck, the corporal checking the side of the building where another couple dozen zombies had appeared. "You boys about done up there?" Caldwell barked through the driver's side window. "We're getting some company." "Just about to light it up," McFadden called. "Good," the sergeant yelled back. "Don't want to subject the oil workers to Rabin any more than I have to." McFadden chuckled. "Considerate of you," he said. "What can I say? I'm compassionate," Caldwell quipped. "Before we head back, though, I have an idea," the corporal said, moving closer to the driver's side. The sergeant groaned. "It's not one of your exciting ideas, is it?" he asked. "Well, it was one before Green talked me out of it," the corporal admitted. "I think we can lure these things out of town and out of our lives." "Sounds fun," Caldwell agreed. "As soon as we get this place burning, we'll get on it." As if on cue, Haddon yelled out and smoke poured out of the room. He leapt from the window, sliding down the ladder and landing hard on the truck bed, coughing heavily. As McFadden went to check on him, Green pulled the ladder down and smacked the roof of the truck for Caldwell to start driving. "Christ, you okay?" the corporal asked, clapping the private on the back as they began moving. "What in the holy fuck was in that stuff?" Haddon wheezed, and as the scent wafted off of him, McFadden gagged at the smell. "If that smell is any indication, it was probably pure cancer," he said, turning his head away. "On the plus side, your chances of dying of starvation just went down dramatically." "Fuck you, McFadden," Haddon gasped with another hacking cough. The corporal laughed and clapped him on the back. "That's fuck you, Corporal," he corrected. Haddon gave him the middle finger as the corporal laughed again. "You'll be fine," McFadden said, and then hit his communicator. "Pull it parallel to the street the zombies are on. Let's get my plan going." "On it," Caldwell replied. The corporal looked back at the hotel as smoke poured from the window. It looked like the fire was spreading quickly, consuming the zombies inside. Chapter 9. The truck made a 3-point turn, aiming towards the outskirts of town. They sat there for a moment, engine idling, and attracting very little attention. They were about 3 blocks from the hotel, which lit up the sky as the sun started to get lower, A huge plume of smoke rose from the building, and the zombies continued to push forward, trying to get inside. McFadden, Green, Murray, and Haddon stood in the back, propped up against the side of the truck, just taking in the sight. "You know, from this angle, with the lights from the fire and the smoke, it almost looks like they're at a concert," Green said. McFadden chuckled. "Good thing they're not, because they wouldn't hear us shooting at them," he quipped. "Guns at the ready?" All 4 men raised their assault rifles, aiming downrange and waiting for McFadden's signal. "No," he said, and the 4 soldiers popped off several rounds, ripping through bodies at the edge of the crowd. The noise generated from their collective firing drew the attention of most of the crowd, and within moments thousands of ghouls shambled towards them, moaning and drawing even more in their direction. The soldiers watched as the side street filled with zombies, slowly coming towards them. "Remind me again why this was a good idea?" Green asked. The corporal shrugged. "Don't worry, we're safe up here," he said. "It just looks horrific and overwhelming. So, looking at the map," Caldwell's voice came through the communicator, "if we drive straight for about a mile, it leads to an access road that eventually goes back to the back of the airport. If we can get these things moving in one direction, we should have enough time to speed off and lose them." McFadden nodded. "That's my thought as well," he said. The corporal looked at the crowd as it grew. There were easily 1,000 zombies all coming at them, with more coming out of the neighborhood. Hundreds emerged from the tree-lined roads. "2 more minutes and we should be good to go," he said. "On your signal," the sergeant confirmed. McFadden watched with pride as the zombies continued to pour out. A small handful of zombies from the hotel was still on fire, and they shambled after the back of the crowd before collapsing. "I see firebugs," the corporal said into the communicator. "Should be the back of the pack." "You boys sit tight," Caldwell replied. "This is going to be a long drive." He put the truck into gear, and it began to move. They were little more than coasting under the momentum of the engine, just a few miles per hour. He occasionally had to hit the brakes in order to slow down so that they didn't lose the horde. "I gotta say, Corporal, this is one of your better ideas," Green quipped. "Talked to a buddy of mine in another division," the corporal drawled. "They tried something just like this during the Battle of Seattle. Said it worked like a charm on a handful of them. Figured it couldn't hurt to test it out on a larger group. Same principles and all." The private nodded thoughtfully. "Well, in a year, or whenever the hell we get back home, you can tell him you improved on his idea," he said. "You really think we're ever getting out of this place?" Murray scoffed. Green shrugged. "Of course, I gotta believe," he said. Murray shook his head, letting out a dark laugh. "With as limited as the resources are," he pointed out, "even if we do manage to get things flowing again, do you think they're going to waste 2 plane loads of fuel to save the lot of us? You need to wake up, man. We're just like we were before this. Expendable assets to be used to accomplish whatever tasks the higher-ups want." Green blinked at him. "God damn, man, how hard did you hit your head?" he asked. "Don't remember you being this vicious." Murray shrugged with a sigh. "As shitty as this place is, if we can get it cleared out, we'll be safe up here," he insisted. "Ain't nothing within 500 miles in every direction. No big cities, nobody trying to take prime real estate from us. Nothing. Just good old-fashioned small-town living." He waved a hand around his head. "But if we're going to get that, we're all going to have to accept the reality that this is home, and work towards making it that way." He started holding up fingers as he listed items. "We got to get that greenhouse up and going, fortify this place so if any of these things come wandering back, they'll be taken care of. And, of course, do our jobs for all those people back in Seattle." He shook his head. "If we start buying into this fantasy that a plane ride home is going to be landing at the airport in the future, we're going to slack off. And if we do that, we ain't going to be surviving long." Green clenched his jaw and nodded dejectedly, staring down at the floor. Murray's gaze softened, and he patted his companion on the shoulder. "Sorry if I hurt your feelings, brother," he said gently. Green shook his head. "Nah, you're good," he assured him. "Sometimes it sucks to know you're right. The 4 soldiers sat in silence for a few moments, just letting the moans from the trailing dead fill the air.
"You know, it's unlikely they're going to come rescue us," Haddon piped up. "But if we can get that greenhouse going good enough, maybe we can convince them to send up a few more people. Not that I don't like y'all, but it is a bit of a sausage fest."
Green shrugged.
"There's that oil girl. Oh, what's her name?" He snapped his fingers. "Skylar. Not trying to burst your bubble again," Murray quipped, "but pretty sure she's got a bigger set than you."
Laughter rippled through the group, and Green gave him a playful shove on the arm.
"I just can't win with you today," he moaned. "Or any other day, if we're telling the truth," Murray quipped.
McFadden rolled his eyes.
"Good to know if we're ever short on entertainment, we can just listen to Murray roasting Green," he quipped.
There were more laughs as Green cracked a smile and shook his head, knowing he was defeated.
"What in the hell are you guys laughing at?" Caldwell came through the communicator. "I can hear you all the way in here."
McFadden grinned.
"Just mocking Green for the size of his manhood compared to Skylar," he reported. "I see," the sergeant replied. "Carry on."
Green playfully flopped backwards, groaning as he removed himself from the conversation, as the rest of the soldiers continued to laugh. An hour later, the truck sat about a mile off of the main road they were on, having sped up to lose the mob. They sat with the engine off, just hanging out as McFadden kept watch with a high-powered scope. The zombie horde in the distance continued to walk forward, just as predicted. They moved right past the turnoff and walked out towards the wilderness.
"I think we're good," the corporal reported. "Most of the group has passed the turnoff. Looks like it worked."
Caldwell clapped him on the back.
"Good plan, Corporal," he said. "So, what now, Sarge?"
Green asked with a sigh.
His superior looked at his map and shrugged. "Looks like we're a few miles from the airport," he said. "Let's unload the plane and get back to the oil company building and fortify it for the night. Then we'll figure out what our next steps are." "Sounds good to me," Haddon replied. "Been a long-ass day."
He stared off at the sun getting lower and lower in the sky.
"And I've never experienced a Canadian winter, but pretty confident I don't want to find out how it feels when the sun goes down." "We better get a move on then," Caldwell said, and jumped down to the ground to head for the driver's seat. Chapter 10. Everybody sat in the lunchroom of the oil building. The corpses had all been removed from the room, but tables were still overturned and blood smeared some of the walls. It was the best they had at the moment, however. The group sat around a big table, waiting on their MREs. "Rabin, did you get the inventory from the warehouse?" Caldwell asked. The private nodded. "The others did the heavy lifting on that with the equipment and product," he said. "I can't make heads or tails of it, but we were right on the food. Found several pallets of emergency MREs. They're the cheap-ass freeze-dried kind they advertise in the back of survivalist magazines, but they'll keep us alive." "How big of a supply are we talking?" the corporal asked. Rabin shook his head. "Assuming it's still good," he tilted his head back and forth. "Might buy us an extra 2, maybe 3 months if we ration it." "Should be enough to get the greenhouse operational again," Murray said. "Get some fresh veggies growing." Green sighed. "Great. Not only am I stuck in this remote town, I also get to become a vegetarian," he muttered. "Not necessarily," Kevin cut in. "There's plenty of game in this part of the world. I spent enough time hunting in my youth that I should be able to bag us the occasional animal." Green pointed firmly at him. "You are officially my favorite person," he declared. "First priority for you, Kevin, is getting the oil fields up and going," Caldwell reminded him. "Actually," Skylar cut in, "it's going to take us a couple of days of prep work before we can even begin on the fields. We need to tour the sites and figure out what's happening with the ones that were left operational. The 3 of us can handle that." The sergeant nodded. "Okay, Kevin. You and Green are on hunting duty," he instructed. "Nobody goes anywhere in this town or outside of it alone." Green perked up, eyes brightening at the thought of a non-MRE meal. "Murray, I want you and McFadden working on the greenhouse," Caldwell continued. Get it set up, plant whatever you need to plant. There are seeds in the gear we unloaded. Get that stuff going." The duo nodded in agreement. "Rest of us are going to be here tomorrow, fortifying this place and finishing up the inventory," Caldwell said, looking around the table. "Once we turn this place into a fortress, we can worry about getting the oil flowing and dealing with the zombies that are still left in town." He looked at the rest of the oil workers. "You okay helping to get this place safe?" Gerald nodded firmly. "It's our home too, Sergeant," he said. "We can pull our weight." "Good to hear," Caldwell said, and got to his feet, pressing his palms against the table as he addressed the room. "I'm proud of each and every one of you. This is one of the most difficult assignments that anybody will undertake, and everyone here is stepping up to do what needs to be done. We may never hear from the people who we help with our actions, but if we weren't here doing what we are doing, the Seattle safe zone would not survive. So thank you." He raised his plastic bottle of water, prompting the rest of them to do the same. "To you all," he said. There was a chorus of cheers and the thuds of plastic bunking against each other before everyone took a sip. "And to us clearing out the nice neighborhood so we have separate housing," Rabin added with a flourish. "Because if I never get a break from some of you, I might just have to wander out into the wilderness, never to return." Murray raised a hand. "Well, I vote for never clearing out the neighborhoods," he quipped. Rabin shot him a playful middle finger as everyone laughed. The laughter and friendly banter continued as they dug into their meals, distracting themselves from the daunting task ahead, and the prospect that this was the last home they would ever know. They knew their sacrifice was necessary, but it didn't make it any lighter a load to bear. The end. Up next. With the need for food and supplies growing, Buck and his biker gang are sent out into the world on a dangerous mission in Seattle Rebuild, Part 3.